Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would continue to answer the questions from the survey that we sent out for the 17th anniversary live show. I got to a lot of the questions during the live show, but also in the last episode, I answered a bunch of questions, so I thought I'd continue. This question is from Anonymous. They say, I'll just summarize. They're asking, let's see, how do I summarize? They're asking, how do I apologize for secretly reading my spouse's messages, text messages or something? But in the process of invading her privacy, I very much discovered that she was trying to hook up with her ex by texting them at 2 a.m. in the morning saying, hey, come over, booty call kind of thing. And the other person said, oh, I'm busy and I don't have a car or something like that. So Anonymous is saying, how do I apologize for invading the privacy of my spouse's phone? And I would say, apologize. Just say you're sorry for invading your partner's privacy. I mean, that's your question. But I think the real question you're asking is, how do I deal with this situation? Because yes, I invaded their privacy, but I also found out that they were trying to cheat on me and God knows what else that they are doing, or do they want to be in a relationship with me? And yeah, it's upsetting. Also, in your question, you were saying that your spouse is refusing to talk about it because you invaded her privacy. She's essentially saying, I'm not going to talk with you about any of this because you invaded my privacy. I find that to be a massive avoidant cop-out. Yeah, it was wrong. I mean, I don't know, but to me, the transgression scale, if you will, breaking it, if I invaded my wife's privacy and looked at her phone without her knowledge, that would be a violation. But if she cheated on me, I mean, everyone can have their own scale, but I'm just going to say that that's worse. If I had somewhat, or another way to put it is, what would I rather have my wife do? Break into my phone without my permission, or cheat on me? I will take breaking into my phone any day of the week. Now, does that mean it's okay to break into someone's phone? No, not at all. That was wrong. That was a violation. That's a trust violation, and it's aggressive. But cheating is a whole other ball of wax. So, yeah. All right, so this next question relates to a question I answered in the last episode, sort of. But Mitko, he says, yes, how do you separate the friend from the therapist in your personal relationships? When friends come to me and share, I find that I often adopt a tone and stance similar to the ones I adopt with my clients, and it feels off. There is a therapist persona projected on me, and often friends come for advice. But I also want to have space to just be friends, or be able to, for example, call them out on something in a way that I wouldn't do in a professional relationship. End of question. Well, first off, in a quick asterisk, I'll just say that for me, that question at the end of with my friends, I want to be more upfront, more authentic, maybe more confrontational, more calling out them, whereas with my clients, I wouldn't. Well, I was sort of like that in the beginning of my career too, but those things have merged. As a friend, I've become more like a therapist. And as a therapist, I've become not more like a friend, but less bottled up in rules of therapy, meaning that I will confront clients more in my later career than I did in the beginning, in a way that I might with a friend, that kind of thing. It's like I said in the last episode, being a therapist is an art form, and there are many different forms of art, right? And there's many different forms of therapy, artistry. So I'll just say that. But you're saying, that your friends come to you for therapy-esque advice, and it's hard to figure out what to do in situations like this. I'll just tell you what I do, which is that people don't come to me a lot, but when they do, I will even explicitly say, I'm not your therapist, and I'll just, depending on the situation, I'll have a little caveat before we even talk about this. So if I'm getting the vibe that they're kind of coming to me as a professional, it'd be the same if you had a friend that was a lawyer and you need law advice. It's natural for people to do that. I also will talk with them in a way that's clear that I'm not their therapist. So I don't take on that quintessential therapist stance, which, like I said, over time, the way that I am as the one major difference between me as a friend and as a therapist is as a therapist, I hardly say anything. I mean, certainly there are times when I can be a little blabby, but for the vast majority of time, I am intently listening, or I am saying very short interjections like, "Oh my God," or "Well, how'd that make you feel?" or something like that. Whereas as a friend, that's not the case. I am more flexible. I probably sense my friend wants me to be more talkative in a situation. So that's a major difference. But the rest of it, the way I listen and the kinds of things I might say are becoming more and more similar anyway. But it's interesting that the way you're framing this question, that you find that you adopt a therapist tone with your friends and it feels off to you. So if it didn't feel off, then I would say it's fine. You're not their therapist, but it feels similar to therapy in that you're listening and you're thinking clinically, which is fine. As long as you understand the boundary and you're being clear with your friends about this, then listening well is both a good thing as a therapist and a good thing as a friend. But it feels off to you, so I'm guessing that it feels maybe distancing to your friend, like you're treating them as if you're a professional or as if they're a client instead of as a peer. And I would work on that. And you might have to force yourself out of that rut when you're with your friends by quote unquote becoming a bad therapist with your friends. Not like a bad listener, but become don't follow the kinds of strictures, if that's a word, that you would when you were a therapist. I hope that makes sense. All right, let's go on to the next question. This next question is interesting. Anonymous patron, he says, can Kirk share his perspective on somewhat emotionally stunted WASPy families? Just chiming in. If you don't know what WASPy means, it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I think that's what it stands for. So it's sort of like mainstream Christian, white, middle-class America, that kind of thing. Anonymous patron wants me to talk about emotionally stunted WASPy families. And chiming in also on that is that a lot of the WASPy families originate from Northwestern Europe, places like England, Scotland, Sweden, Norway, France maybe. And these cultures on the scale of the world tend to be more emotionally distant and stunted, if you will. Not that there aren't other cultures that have emotional stunting. I mean, Japan has their problems with that sort of thing, so it's not just that. But, being uptight, being a little avoidant, being private, being too independent is definitely a theme that possibly goes back hundreds of years. Anyway, going on. My spouse feels so alienated from his otherwise very kind and loving family who have such a hard time dealing with difficult emotions. All right, just chime in. So it sounds like for anonymous patron, her husband, her husband is in a WASPy family, to the point that they fail to do things like death notification and risk them finding out about death of loved ones over social media. Right, I read that funny. So to the point of when someone dies in the family, like an aunt or an uncle, not someone that's like super close, then they won't call the family members And what ends up happening is her husband might find out on social media through the grapevine, if you will, that his family member, his extended family member, had died. And yeah, I've seen this before, and it is indicative of waspy family, emotionally stunted, distant, waspy families. It's really weird to me. It's this complete avoidance of anything emotional when everything is pointing in the direction of, you've got to face this, my friend. And if they give it just 2 seconds of thought, they would realize that, of course, you should notify everyone in the family that Uncle Tom died, and not tell them, one, and also not put them in a position where they have to suddenly learn through the grapevine that someone died without being informed. It's just ridiculous. And as someone that I come from, on my white side, you could argue that there's a bit of waspiness in there for sure, but my parents aren't like that. So, I have it, the tradition both on the white side and the Japanese side is risk of, both sides have the potential risk of being emotionally stunted and distant, but in my family, we're not generally like that. And I find that when I interact with other families and when I talk with clients, I often will realize that my family was different in that way. I mean, not that we're fantastic with emotions, but a lot better with stuff like that anyway going on. With me, he is able to grieve about the loss of my loved ones, but dealing with his family is tough. Refusing to do funerals so people can process. I don't want to be a burden kind of talk. I'm trying not to overfunction for my spouse and call his family, but what should I do? End of question. Yeah, I don't know. I would just, try to tell at the very least your spouse, hey, this is my opinion of the way your family tends to deal with this sort of thing. I still love your family, and I'm sure there are reasons, transgenerational reasons. They were probably taught to do this when they were growing up, but it doesn't seem emotionally healthy. It's not the end of the world, but so I just want to let you know from my perspective. And sometimes that can really help because an outsider's point of view can really help someone to realize that, oh, this isn't the way everyone does it. Now, your spouse might not really appreciate any sort of help, as you're saying. You don't want to overfunction. So I would definitely watch out for that. But the other thing is that you're in a relationship, and these family members on his side of the family are your family. And so you're grieving too. And that's another American kind of thing, is we tend to see in-laws as like pesky annoyances at the very least, if not just like not really a part of your life. And, certainly there are reasons to do that if your in-laws are abusive or something. But I find that also to be something that my family didn't do. And although I will say there are times when that can happen for sure. So we could probably do better with that. But it's okay for you to say, husband of mine, here's my observation of your family, but I personally feel harmed when they don't inform us that your uncle died or whatever it is, So you can make it about you. That doesn't override him, right? He has more of a right. It's more his jurisdiction, so to speak. But yeah, I don't know. It's really hard to change anything, let alone change your in-laws and their culture and everything. Maybe there's someone on his side of the family that you can talk with about this and just say, hey, I just, when Uncle Tom died and my husband found out on social media, I just have to say that, I'll just speak for myself. I didn't know Uncle Tom that well, but I kind of knew him, and it just felt hurtful that we weren't informed. And I'm not saying that people are being jerk faces, but there just seems to be some kind of avoidance, or people don't want to bother us, or I don't know. What do you think that's, just maybe have a conversation. All right, this next question I get a lot. Anonymous says, Can you talk a bit about sibling abuse? I feel like it's not discussed often and it isn't taken seriously. End of question. Yeah, I've fielded this question many times because it's not talked about enough. And I won't talk at length about it right here, but I just want to emphasize that sibling abuse can be at times more harmful than parent abuse. Not always, of course, but the factor that isn't often present in other perpetrators is that your sibling can often be way more cruel than your parents would be. Certainly parents can be cruel, but when your older brother or sister, when your older sibling is 12 or 8 or even 15, they do not have a moral compass developed yet. They don't have a prefrontal cortex developed yet. They also don't feel responsible for anyone's feelings, let alone their pesky younger sibling. And so their abuse will be off the charts. The cruelty and the violence and the harm. And then as a victim, often you don't have support from your caregivers or from the rest of the family, or at the very least not enough. And so that's a double harm, right? That people are either not doing enough or they're doing nothing. You don't matter. So that's another abuse, right? Something bad is happening to you, regardless of what it is. And the people who are supposed to protect you are doing nothing or not enough. Or maybe even blaming you. Stop. Well, you must be doing something. It's the same with being bullied at school. These kinds of experiences can, not always, obviously, but they absolutely can be just as traumatizing as any other, can produce all the same PTSD and complex PTSD and the sort of traumas that result in personality disorders. Yeah, it's rough. All right, this is another question I get a lot from Anonymous. He says, what are your thoughts on hypnosis in the clinical setting? Have you seen it used or used it yourself? Does it seem to be a useful tool? End of question. Okay, so I've probably, if you've listened to the podcast or watched one of my live streams, the Q&A, this question almost always comes up. And I get it because I don't talk about it naturally very often. And it is one of those areas that as a layperson or even as a clinician, there's not enough talk from, mainstream people like myself. So what I'll say is that it's a broad topic. Hypnosis has a lot of history, but in a nutshell, I'll say that there are some claims by hypnotherapists that are supported by the data. But anecdotally, in my experience, 99% of the claims made by people who use hypnosis, whether they're a clinician or not, are not supported by data. In fact, have been demonstrated to not be an outcome of hypnosis, like being able to control someone's mind, for example. Now, it's complicated because what do we mean by controlling someone's mind? Some people appear to be predisposed or open enough to the sort of hypnosis experience where they can, what they would call is an experience where they were being controlled and that they don't remember it. But it's not clear, and it seems highly likely that they were just choosing to go along with it, and the hypnosis practitioner, whether a clinician or not, is just very, very good, charismatic, or they have a very good technique of helping people, one, to relax, and two, to trust them and to feel okay with, barking like a dog on all fours. Now, when we go on stage, then all bets are off because people are on stage, and they have massive incentive to play along. I will often think about this one moment when I was in the Magician Castle, or what do they call it, in LA. It's like a private club of some kind. It's not super private, but anyway, I went there, and it's really great if you ever get a chance to get in there. You have to go by invitation or something. Anyway, and there's all these magicians that are Magic Castle, I think it's called, and all these magicians are doing their routine, but I think they're practicing. I'm not sure, and the crowds are really small, and so it's very intimate, and everyone's dressed to the nines, and these very fancy. It's in this old kind of house, It's really cool. But I'm in the front row, and this guy pulls. I think I got pulled on. There were a number of different magicians in different rooms, and I think every single room I was pulled on stage. So I must have that look on my face that I will play along, because why would they pull someone up on stage otherwise? And so this one magician pulled me on stage, and he was doing this trick, and then he it's hard to describe, but when it came to the punchline of the trick, he held up his hand, but on his palm of his hand, I could see either the number or the word that he wanted me to say. It's probably like, think of a number between 1 and 50. And then I think, but don't tell me what that is. And so I think of like 12. And then he does this whole trick, blah, 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 blah. And then he reveals a card or something, and it says, 35. And then on his hand, the crowd can see 35, but I can't. And so on his hand, it says 35. So what number is it? And I had this split second where I was going to either say 35, which would have made the trick work, or I was going to say my real number, which was not 35, something like that. And it was so quick. And, why would I ruin everyone's time? And he probably picked me. They might even have ways of observing people when they're walking around in line or something to kind of gain an idea of someone's willingness to do that kind of thing. And I'm guessing most people go along with it because, again, you're on stage. And do you want to ruin something and all you have to do is say 35 and you don't lose anything, And so with hypnosis, it's on stage anyway. It seems like that's a factor. Now you'll hear anecdotes, but no, I swear to God, and some of you might have even experienced something like that. But again, we have to define what being able to influence someone exactly. Where's the line between flat out being able to control someone and make them do whatever you want them to do, which is the way that it often is talked about. Because if that was true, can you imagine the cult leaders and their ability out there to get an army of people that they can control fully? Like it's not full control, right? And it's either extremely temporary or the person, there's a part of them that maybe even unconscious that is saying, I'm going to go along with this because I'm okay and I feel safe. And we've done experiments on this sort of thing, many, many experiments, because, psychology, especially during times of war, is extremely interested in mind control for various reasons. And the data demonstrates that it's not. Now, there are clinical uses like relaxation, like helping people as they are going into trauma. It can possibly help some people recall, but it's not like there's a window into someone's memory. It's more like just helping them to feel safe, helping them to feel relaxed so that they can recall things. It's also unclear as to whether or not hypnosis memory recall is actual memory recall and not suggested, right? Because as a practitioner of hypnosis, you can insert things into people's minds more easily when they're relaxed, and especially if they're willing to go along with things. So there's that. And I've seen people use this. I had some friends that did this kind of work, and the practitioners that I know always stayed within the science and were always tentative about what they could promise and what they attempted with clients. I sent a client one time to a friend of mine to recall memories from her child because she didn't remember a single memory from 0 to 9 or something like that. like not a thing. Like they lived in a house, their family, from the time she was born until she was like 6 or 7, and she doesn't remember that house. She doesn't, by the time you get to 5, 6, 7, there will be some memories, right? And her siblings would remember all sorts of things. And, she was traumatized, my client. But it gave her great distress that she couldn't remember anything. And so in conjunction with the trauma treatment, she went to a hypnotherapist, and it didn't work. And she did it for a long time. Not to say that hypnotherapy doesn't ever work in a situation like that, but it didn't work then. And you'll see people make claims about addiction treatment, that hypnosis, I had a friend actually that went to a hypnotherapist to stop smoking. And with one hypnotherapy session, she was smoking all the time and had tried a lot of things to quit. It wasn't working. And then she did that and she stopped smoking. And I don't know how long, I can't remember how long she stopped smoking, but because that's the other thing is like, you might get a temporary effect, but is it long lasting? Now, for her, I'm quite sure that it wasn't just the hypnotherapy that helped. It was her ongoing efforts to remain sober, right? So it wasn't like she could just not put any effort, but she claimed that it completely took away the craving. Now, there's a thing called placebo. And so there's that. But does that mean that it's useless? No. Placebo is a wonderful, if it's a placebo for her, then it was a very cheap placebo that gave her a wonderful outcome that other forms of treatment, therapy even, might not have helped at all. So it doesn't make it worthless. Just because something is placebo doesn't mean that it's worthless or stupid. It just depends on the outcome. So if someone goes to chiropractic, or if they do Reiki, or if they do, I don't know, whatever, or they have someone pray for them and it works, then it works. That's all you need to know. But before going into these things, you just have to understand that there is science there, meaning that when they do this on thousands of people, many of whom believe it's going to work, they find that it's no better than placebo, meaning that there are some people that it works, so to speak, with, but it's the same as if you were to give people a sugar pill and tell them that this was a new medication that could cure them of smoking. It has the same effect. There are people that go into these control groups and are not given the medication. When they test antidepressants, for example, they'll take 500 people, they'll take 1,000 people with depression. They'll randomly sort the 1,000 people into 2 groups, and then they will give 500 people the new compound, and they'll give the other 500 people the exact same looking medication, but it is a sugar pill, doesn't have anything in it. And the practitioner or the lab tech who was giving the placebo versus the medication, they also don't know whether or not it's placebo or not, because the administrator of the drug can sometimes tip people off. That's just what we call double-blind, randomly controlled trial. And so what we find is that for antidepressants that work, like Prozac or something, that it's better than the improvements on reducing depressive symptoms on the whole for each of the 2 groups. The treatment group has, say, an improvement of 10, whatever unit you want to put there, and the placebo group has an improvement of 5. For those people in the placebo group, it's real. Their depressive symptoms did go down, and for some of them, it would be for the very first time. And they will swear up and down they must have been given the antidepressant, but they weren't, and we know that because we have the data. Does that mean that they're making it up? Does it mean it's all in their head? Does it mean they're faking it? No, they're legitimately feeling better. So, can hypnotherapy work in that way? Absolutely. Are there legitimate usages? Yeah. Like I said, relaxation. I'm trying to remember the other things. And in my field of family therapy, there's a branch of it of like Milton Erickson and the brief therapist. The thing is, maybe it's detected in my voice, but if you don't live in my world, then you might not know that there's just a lot of bullshit being said about a lot of things, and hypnotherapy is one of those things. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any use. It absolutely does. But there's so much bullshit that's being talked about, and there's so many clinicians that not only buy in, but are, spreading the bullshit around. And it's after 30 years of being a therapist, it just gets fucking tiring. And so, no, I've never used it, and the outcomes that it has been shown to be somewhat helpful for, I have many other ways of doing that. I don't need to do hypnosis. So that's my long-winded answer to that. All right, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. This next question is from Ralph. He says, if you were an animal, which one would you be and which one would you want to be? End of question. Very common question. I think we got this, some version of this question a number of times. Which one would I be? I don't know. Like a sloth? Because I feel like I'm always at home just hunkering down. I don't know. Which one would I want to be? I've always said I wanted to be a duck because ducks can do it all. They can fly, swim, walk, swim underwater. They seem like they're having a good time. Except when it comes to sex. So maybe not, because you hear about those stories. Basically, don't ducks rape each other? Yeah, so I shouldn't say duck. No. Some other bird, because flying would be awesome. All right, this next question is pretty interesting and complicated. Deserving YouTube member Linda, she asks, I'll just paraphrase, what do I do with my partner who is using weaponized incompetence and they might have depression or ADHD? So weaponized incompetence, I made a whole episode about it recently, I think. And the off-the-head definition is that when someone fakes incompetence because they're trying to manipulate someone into doing the task for them. And it's important that the word intentionally fake is there, because you might come across someone who you surmise is competent, but they seem to, at least they're saying that they're incompetent. And you're like, you can absolutely do that. I don't, and to assume that this person is faking is very likely wrong-headed. Weaponized incompetence is a thing, but it's manipulative and lying. And if you have a partner that is using weaponized incompetence, even at a minor level, then there's probably a lot of problems with that person. Because it's straight up, you're straight up trying to almost brainwash your partner into believing something that isn't true to manipulate them. It's Machiavellian, So now there's gray zones where people, I can even think of situations for myself where I really just don't want to do something, but I could do it, and I will emphasize certain annoying, like today. I don't know if this counts, but I shouldn't even begin to talk about this because it'll be such a rabbit hole. But in brief, I have a long, angry, rageful history with smoke detectors. I am so fucking annoyed with the way that they're designed. I actually have looked into the engineering of these things. I understand they often have a bit of radioactive material and a sensor and and I understand how the batteries work. I have renovated homes. I know how to wire homes. I know how, these things are wired today. They're often all connected, blah, blah, blah. So, I'm probably more competent about these things than Stacy is, but I get so I've torn apart smoke detector. I've taken smoke because like when you take them off the ceiling and you take the battery out, there's still a small battery that's like buried in there and it'll still chirp. And I find it to be one, think of anything else that you own where the battery is going low and it is that fucking annoying. And I get it. It's like, well, what if there's a fire and your battery's going out? Well, often the smoke detectors in my house, they're all wired to the panel. So they have continuous power. When it starts to chirp, it's just the backup battery. That's all that's happening. And that only is needed when the power goes out. So to have all those things happen at once, and in all likelihood, the battery still has like 25% power and it's just being safe or something, And I also, most homes have many smoke detectors. So if one isn't working, it's not like your house is going to burn down while you're sleeping and then you never wake up. Anyway, so now I am big on fire safety. I have a fire extinguisher that is new. It's been serviced and it's ready to go under every sink in our house, and there's one in the garage. There's I have them, and I do fire drills with Stacy. I have a fire blanket. I am serious. Now, I've never had a fire. I don't know anyone, but I've seen enough YouTube videos and Reddit videos of fires that get out of control real quick. And and yet, when it comes to these fucking things, every other device will just have a little light. Maybe it'll kind of chirp, but these things, it chirps every 60 fucking seconds, and it's alarm level loudness, and it'll happen in the middle of the fucking night when you're sleeping. And now, could I go to therapy and grow up and become mature and manage my rage? It's just a matter of perspective. Yes, I could do that, but I don't fucking want to, and I've tried, and it's hard. Stacy has eternal patience when it comes to this sort of thing, and so recently I delegated to her. I begged her, can you please, if I have to do this anymore, because part of it is that there's all these little things in the house. There's so many things. I could just go on and on. When you are living in a house that you're responsible for, it's just never ending. A door handle stops working. A window won't shut. A battery for this thing won't work. A circuit breaker starts to go bad. It's just never ending. And so I do literally every single task along those lines because, I don't know, I'm the guy. But at some point I was just like, so today, one of them started to chirp and I started to, get enraged. And I'm just staring at it from underneath it as it's chirping. And it's also in the garage, so I'm worried about the neighbors getting upset because it's sort of, you can hear it from the street, And my anxiety is going up, and I just went to Stacy and I was like, can you take care of this? Because I'm going to lose my mind. Because I'm just staring at it, and I'm trying to read. They put the words, it's embossed, and it's not, anyway. So I'm sure, actually, I think it literally took her like 2 minutes to fix. But is that weaponized incompetence? I don't know. Because I don't want to do it. I could do it. And I'm being a baby about it. Like, Kirk, calm the fuck down. Like, let it go. You're choosing. I am. At the very least, I'm choosing not to regulate, or I'm choosing not to try, or I don't know. Is that weaponized incompetence? I don't know. But I'm not being dishonest with Stacy. I tell her, I'm losing my mind. Can you please do this for the two of us? And this happened like a year ago. I just went to her and I said, can you please be in charge of this? And you could certainly ask me questions, but honestly, you're smarter than I am probably, and you're definitely more patient, and you're also very conscientious, and so I would just look up information about, you'll just do it, and there will be no complaining from me anyway. So having said all that, if you actually have a partner, deserving member Linda, who is actually using weaponized incompetence, but you're also going, well, he might have depression and ADHD. Yeah. I would, if I were to put my money on something without knowing anything about him, I'm saying him, but you're saying they. So sorry about that. That's just me being, heteronormative. So, anyway, but honestly, anyway, I was going to say, aren't people usually talking about weaponized incompetence when it comes to men? Because that's a kind of, I don't know. So, meaning that I think a lot of guys will do that, especially with house chores. Anyway, but they might have depression or ADHD. So if I were to put my money on something, given the way you're asking the question, I would put a fair amount of money that it is depression or ADHD or both, and that, they are, quote unquote, competent enough to do the task, but due to these issues that are real, they don't know how to ask for accommodation or for support, or they don't even know really what's going on with them. And the amount of effort that they have to exert just to do a simple task that they are competent in is so great that they act incompetent in a last-ditch effort to manipulate you to do it. So that's still weaponized incompetence in a sense, but there's a justifiable reason why they are doing it. And I would just open a conversation about that. All right, let's take a break. All right, I've got to go faster if I'm going to get through these. Anonymous, she says, what's the psychological impact of removing content from museums like that about Japanese internment camps? And if current government removes information, how can communities organize to safeguard this for future generations? End of question. Yeah, it's upsetting. And, Anonymous, I'm guessing you know the answer to there's no way to, it's a bad thing and it has a bad effect. And it makes it so that it's more likely to happen in the future. One could argue it's happening right now in the United States, and that the acknowledgement of, and even just the phrase Japanese internment camps, I don't like that. It sounds kind of nice, right? It's internment camp. No, this was a fucking prison with machine guns on guard towers turned inward. So call it what it is. It's a prison camp, a concentration camp. So yeah. And to erase that history. Now, museums, they have to prioritize a lot of different things, and might there be some rational decision to include other things over Japanese internment camp display? Yeah, there's, in fact, I would argue that of the East Asian American groups that get attention, Japanese people get disproportionately more attention than other groups. Like, there's hardly any acknowledgement of Filipino Americans who have been here. Like in Seattle, I remember learning this like decades ago, that of the East Asians in Seattle, and don't quote me on this, but this is my vague memory, was like maybe 5 to 10 times more Filipino Americans in the Seattle area than Japanese Americans. And yet, at least back then, there were no Filipino restaurants. There were very small Filipino cultural events, but they weren't really, officially sanctioned by the community. They were often just one-off things that were happening. And so, what do we privilege in these museums? What do we privilege in our society? So there, those questions have to be asked. Also, as we start moving forward in time and we get further away from World War II, things just kind of start to fade from people's interest, and because there are things before World War II that were atrocities that just feel less impactful. That doesn't mean we don't talk about it. It doesn't mean we don't have displays about it. But, museums are at least partially trying to entertain, which sounds kind of funny, but, they are. And, I could see the Japanese internment camp stuff just not being as relevant or something. I don't know. I mean, obviously for myself, because I have family that were imprisoned, my great-grandparents were, I don't know, like in their 60s or 70s when they were, I mean, can you imagine? Only what you can carry, and you're 75, and you just have to walk away from your business and your home and all of your things and all your creature comfort. Just imagine that for yourself, that you're informed that tomorrow you have to show up at a train station and you don't know what's going to happen to you. And then the government had the fucking nerve to draft the Japanese Americans who were imprisoned or who had parents that were imprisoned to fight for American freedom. If you want to look it up, look up the No Boys. Now, many Japanese Americans said, okay, fine, we'll fight and we'll fucking show you, assholes, how patriotic us Japanese Americans can be, born in the United States. And they went on, the 42nd in Europe, they went on to be, to this day, the most decorated military unit of all time in American history, because they just threw themselves at the enemy, at the Nazis. They just went balls to the wall. I don't know, it just makes me want to cry. Anyway, more questions. All right, this next question from Anonymous. He says, if you had to pick one song to represent humanity, what would it be and why? Oh my God. I don't know. Like to aliens or something, or to ourselves? I don't know. There's this one classical music song that I can't remember the name of that I find to just be the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Ludwig van, good old Ludwig van, a little bit of the old In and Out and Ludwig van. Opus 22 second movement, Allegretto. So I picked that song. What advice do you have for someone who was just cheated on in a relationship? My boyfriend of 2 years just cheated on me online. He ended our phone call to sex someone else. What advice do you have for someone who was just cheated on in a relationship? Yeah, it's rough. There's a lot of grief because there is a loss there. It might not be the loss of the relationship, but it is a loss. Get support, but also be wary of friends that are reactive and say, you should dump him, and maybe, if that's what you want to do. But I'm not a fan of friends that try to find easy answers. I prefer friends that just listen and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened, or share their own stories of having been cheated on or something. So yeah, just work your way through the feelings. And one piece of advice is to day-to-day think about your needs. Maybe that means not having contact with your boyfriend. Maybe it means actually having more contact with your boyfriend, but just listen to that and advocate for yourself. All right, this next question is from Annual Patron from California. She says, people often confide really personal stuff to me, including coworkers and even strangers in public. Growing up, adults often told me age-inappropriate things. My therapist will even raise her eyebrows sometimes and say, they told you this? I got used to it as a kid, but what kind of vibe could I be giving off that this is still happening with people I don't know or barely know? End of question. Yeah, well, two things I'll say is that I've experienced people like you, and I don't know what it is. There is something about some people's vibe that is just, it's impossible to put a finger on. I mean, there are certain things that you can kind of point to, like, well, you have a very safe face, or you listen well, or you have a very approachable vibe, non-judgmental, or you don't seem like you would judge or that you would scowl at anybody, or you don't seem to have like rage or anger or prickliness or whatever. or you're attractive, or you're attractive in a mother way. That's something that happens sometimes, is that if you're both attractive and you kind of look like a mother, if that makes sense, or dress like a mother, then there can be that. Sometimes it's literally just like the style of your hair can be inviting to people, just sort of, it's associated with a warm embrace of listening or something. The other thing is there's a lot of people walking around who want to talk to people, so it doesn't surprise me that when someone comes along that might seem that way. There's also a possibility that you are eliciting it somehow, and that you are seeking people out who have things that they want to get off their chest and are unconsciously doing things to elicit that from others. You talked about how when you were growing up, adults often told you age-inappropriate things. I'm going to take a guess and say that involved your parents. And what that says is that you were groomed as a child to be parentified, to be a companion, as you know, to have the companionate role is what we call in family therapy. And what that does is it rewards you subtly and intensely for being available for that and for even eliciting that. And so in the same way that if someone is sexually abused by someone chronically growing up, they are subtly being trained to be appealing in a way. This doesn't happen to everyone, and not everyone defends in this way as an adult, but for abuse victims, they will find that they seem to attract rapists or coercive sexual partners or just abusive people. And they don't understand what's happening. And we don't blame victims, but the syndrome of the ongoing effects of that sort of trauma can have an unfortunate side effect, which is to attract people like this and to not see the signs, so to speak. So you might be recreating the trauma that you've been through, even though sometimes it might not be harming you exactly. You know, if like the cab driver opens up to you or something, maybe that doesn't harm you. But I could see it harming because there's a possibility that you don't even know you're being harmed because you weren't allowed to ask that question of yourself when you were young. And even if the cab driver is just the cab driver, it's an emotional outlay that you have to give, and you're not being focused on, right? So that's what I would say about that. All right, this next question is from YouTube member Bailey. She basically asks, she says, me and my husband are becoming parents and we want to raise healthy children. What specific resources beyond therapy would I recommend to help build a secure attachment with the kids? And there are many good resources out there. I only know about a small few, and one resource is the John Gottman Institute. I'm not sure what it's called, but John and Julie Gottman have a lot of research based and a lot of good advice about how to raise healthy children, and they concentrate on attunement and all that kind of stuff. But there are many other resources. I would just look for resources that are not religious, are not politically based, because there's so many charlatans out there. I would just not follow any one group. You could absolutely follow the John Gottman people because they're not charlatans, but I would, you think about Jody Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke. These people were true monsters and behind bars now because of their monstrous torturing acts on children. If you listen to my podcast about that, or you just know the story, and they were, they had a lot of students. They made a lot of money giving parenting advice. And so it's just like, how do you detect? I just hope that if you listen to my podcast, you'd be able to detect stuff like that. All right, next question from Lala. She says, I just realized that I might be going into a fawn response instead of what I thought was people-pleasing. Can you please describe the difference? End of question. Yeah, I don't know the literature on this. I'm guessing that there are some clinicians who will put that on a spectrum where you have low-grade people-pleasing, which we would call people-pleasing, still a problem, but not as bad or as pathological as fawning. And I guess the difference that I would say is that fawning is a trauma response, meaning that the individual has a spike in distress being exposed to something that reminds them of the trauma. Whereas people-pleasing is more of an ongoing anxiety that isn't likely to have spikes and the spikes of distress that are associated with PTSD and trauma. Now, traumatized people can grow up to be people pleasers, but that would be the distinction I would use. But really, I probably use those terms sometimes interchangeably because it could be argued that they are essentially in the same ballpark. And I don't know. So that's my answer to that question. All right, this next question comes from Anonymous. She is basically saying that marijuana is now legal in where they live in Canada, and they are wondering if I have ever had patients who have taken edibles to open consciousness and to improve emotional well-being. And what I'll say is that there's a lot of initial research looking into this, and there seem to be some promising results for some people, and things are already being prescribed along these lines. A lot of data is in on this regarding some discrete things like with appetite or with pain. And it's kind of case by case basis. Like if someone has pain and they've tried a lot of different treatments and they still want relief, I'll definitely suggest that they give it a try with doctor's approval, whether through gummy bears or smoking or creams or something. And, there's also various different mixtures and, whether it's THC or CBD or whatever, there's a lot of different variants. And so I will recommend people experiment with that with medical oversight. But but in terms of emotional well-being, that's why people do it recreationally. It's because it makes them feel better, helps them relax. That's why people do it. So I have always had clients, whether it was legal or not, who have used marijuana in various different ways. And I've over 30 years talked with lots of clients about how they use marijuana along these lines. Because, as a therapist, I am trying to treat the whole person, and if they smoke weed every night at 8 o'clock after the kids go to bed, then at the very least, I'd like to know what's going on. And I will say sometimes if it becomes habitual and it starts to affect their marriage or their mood, which it can do, or their motivation, then, I'll absolutely have a conversation with that. But, I've had many clients that will drink somewhat habitually or use marijuana habitually, and, we'll have a conversation about it, but I'm not going to come down on them, because sometimes it's just a matter of the trade-offs, right? It's like, well, I could go down a road of sobriety, but what would I be giving up? And of course, as a clinician, I'm quote unquote supposed to say that sobriety is better, but we don't know that, and data doesn't necessarily show that. It just depends on the person. It depends on the case. It depends on what you privilege. With respect to alcohol, if you look at longevity of life, if you look at the health of your organs or cancer risk, then you should never drink. And any amount of drinking is going to risk those things. It's going to risk killing you. It's going to risk cancer. It's going to risk mood problems or addiction, nervous system it's just there's so many problems with alcohol. But on the other hand, there's a lot of wonderful things about alcohol that you don't typically hear clinicians talk about, which is that it feels great for some people, and it it lowers inhibitions, and it helps people to relax, and it intensifies life. Marijuana, similar, right? And other drugs, cocaine. So when it comes to my clients, I just take it on a case-by-case basis. Anyway. All right. Anonymous, she has another question here. She says, both parents are important for a child, but which parents mostly contribute to emotional regulation as a child between the age of 0 to 10-year-old for a boy? Thanks. Well, research shows there are some gender differences when we actually look at a lot of questions regarding child outcomes and development. And there is research along these lines, but the signal is pretty small, meaning that from my memory of this research, and I was pretty well versed in a lot of these studies back in the day, that like I remember there's a lot of research showing that when men are involved helping kids to roughhouse well, roll around and play and that kind of thing, that when a child has that element in their life, then they are better able to X, Y, and Z. I can't remember exactly what that is. It was probably like play with other people or manage physicality and play, or I can't remember what it was, but something like that. So might there be gender differences? Because that's basically what you're asking. It's like, when it comes to a boy, is it better for the dad to help with that? Or do they have more of an effect? So the general answer I will say is that there are no gender differences regarding the kid or the parents. At the very least, 99.99999% of the development of emotional regulation for a child of any gender, boy or otherwise, is due to attunement and safety and love. And that can come from anyone of any gender. All right, this next question is from Abby, and I'll summarize. She asks what advice I would give for her changing her legal name. And she wants to change her legal name because of the trauma she went through. I think from context, she was abused by her parents, or at least one of her parents, and she doesn't like the fact that her last name comes from that parent. And she even says that she took a poll when she was in the 6th grade about what she should change her name to. So this has been something on her mind for a long time. But the wrinkle here is that she has kids, 4 kids between the ages of 3 and 11. And she didn't go into detail, but I think that those kids probably have this name that she wants to change. So does she change her name only, or does she change the name of the whole family? I mean, the 3-year-old probably doesn't care. And also the extended family might kind of react funny to it, or who knows, right? What I would say is fucking go for it, man. Like, fuck that name, fuck that person. You've been thinking about this since the 6th grade. Now, for a lot of people that go through trauma, this isn't what they focus on, right? So it's clearly something that holds a lot of meaning to you, a lot of symbolic meaning and a lot of practical meaning, So I say go for it, and then just I would give your kids the chance to make the choice for themselves. Will it be a little weird if the 11-year-old has a different last name than the rest of you? Sure. But, fuck people and their stupid stigmas. Just tell them the truth. If the 7th grade teacher asks, so why do you have a last name? But I can't imagine anyone asking, right? They would just assume. Now, maybe they would assume, well, the 11-year-old came from a different father or something. And so many families now have that, and it's not like the stigma of before. Is there still stigma? Yeah, but there are bigger fish to fry, which is something that you've been really wanting to do since you were in the 6th grade. So I say do it. I know people that did. My mentor actually did. In fact, it was kind of weird. Paul David, who died not too long ago from assisted suicide. Well, I always knew him as Paul David, but I didn't know until years into knowing him that his real name was, so I always knew him as, Paul, his first name Paul, and his last name David. But apparently, and I can't remember the exact details, but apparently that was like his first and middle name, and then he had a different last name, and I forget what it was. So, it was Paul David, like Anderson or something. And I believe oh boy, it's been a long time since I talked with him about this, but I think he might have changed his last name because he wanted to distance himself from his family of origin, or he just wanted to reinvent himself. So I can't remember, but he did it. And sometimes I would hear people calling him David because he grew up being called David, whatever last name. And I think it's because, anyway, he was one of those middle name people that you went by your middle name, I think. Anyway, but when his wife would call him David, I thought, why would your wife call you by your last name? Usually that's like what friends do or colleagues will do. Like, what's going on? And then I heard, anyway. So yeah, do it, and sooner the better, right? Because for the younger kids, they won't probably remember if you do it early enough. Next question, Colorado Olivia says, "What's the toughest lesson you've had to learn the hard way?" Well, the first one that pops into my mind is to not fuck around with mandated reporting. If you know, you know. I had a private practice client that had disclosed to me that an older sibling had sexually abused the younger sibling. And when I hear reports of that, I have to immediately, within 48 hours, make a report. It's on the law. It's the ethical thing to do. And because I was just starting out in private practice, and because I was getting further away from my ethics training, I did an independent assessment and said, well, the spirit behind the rule of that law is that we're trying to protect kids, right? And I have assessed the family as doing everything above and beyond to protect that younger kid. For example, they had a 2-story house, and the girl was downstairs and the boy was upstairs, and there was a locked door. So the boy had no contact and no ability to contact the daughter, the victim. And they were in therapy, and we were working on it, and the parents were, doing all the responsible things. And so I thought, well, even if we called CPS, they would come to the house, do an assessment, and I'm guessing would say, okay, you're good, stay in therapy. I knew this because outside of private practice, I was also hired by CPS to go into homes and do this kind of work. And I knew exactly how CPS operated, and I knew exactly what they would say. Well, I didn't know, but I suspected. Well, the parents that I was working with was the mom and the stepdad. Well, the bio dad had some kind of personality disorder, and he loved to sue people. And although he didn't want CPS to be called himself, he just loved to use the legal system against people. And so even though he himself really didn't want CPS to be called, he wasn't the custodial parent, he tattled on me, which I deserved to be tattled on. He was right. And I got in trouble, and I thought, well, there goes my career. Back then, I didn't know how these things worked. And I just had this stereotype that all therapists, I think, start with, which is that when you do something wrong, it's over. It's lights out on your career. Maybe you go to jail. Who knows? And I had a number of sleepless nights, and I took full responsibility. I didn't make any excuses, and I just thought, shit, you know better. And I had to learn the hard way. And then from that point forward, I'll be damned if I'm going to make that mistake again. And I never did. And what ended up happening was, so for those, I think it was like a few days where I was just waiting for the what do you call that? The guillotine to fall. And then when they called me, I remember where I was was in my bedroom and they called me in, and I'm like, okay, here it comes. And she just had this, the CPS worker just had this little preamble, and then, and she says, do you know what you did wrong? And yeah, are you going to do it again? No. Do you understand why? Yeah. Okay, well, don't do it again. And see ya. I was like, wait, that's it? But that makes sense, because what good does it do to throw me in jail or take away my license? Like, we need clinicians out there. Now, I'll be the first to say if someone does something wrong, they need to be punished. Or I would say that for people to learn the lesson, they have to be sufficiently punished, right? And it was sufficiently punished. It worked on me, the 3 days of wondering, But there are some clinicians who have so many problems with their practice that they should just be removed from the profession altogether. And I guess it's self-serving for me to say that wasn't the case in my case. But anyway. But yeah, that was the toughest learn, or one of the ones I had to, that comes to mind. Olivia also asks, in your opinion, what is the significance of Revan and his impact on the Star Wars universe? Wait, Revan, Star Wars. It's a books thing? I don't know who Revan is. So I'm just going to move on. But I love your question. All right, this next question is from Lestrange. She says, if sent to live on a deserted planet to live for 6 months, what book would you bring to pass the time? End of question. It's interesting that it's a deserted planet. Like the planet was deserted or it's deserted. I don't know the difference. Anyway, as a thought experiment, I understand the question, and I don't know because I'm mildly dyslexic. So maybe any book, and it would take me 6 months to get through it. Honestly, for those who listened to that episode I made, I think last year, where I'm like, oh my God, I think I'm dyslexic. So many things just continually come to mind, and I go, oh my God, that was dyslexia. I don't know if I told you all about this, but I never was able to memorize Stacy's phone number, and it became a joke. And I always just figured I was lazy. Or, I think I was just like, I'm lazy. Because if I really wanted to memorize it, I could sit down and just really pump it into my head. But Stacy didn't have to do that for my phone number. Why? Because she's not dyslexic. Although sometimes she wonders if she's, even more mild than me in some ways, because there are some signs. But she reads books for fun, which is a big sign that she can't be, I mean, not that that's a definitional thing, but she reads at the normal speed. Anyway, but one day it just clicked in my head. It's like, oh my God, for years and years and years. Now with contemporary cell phones, and even in the past, like with speed dial and whatnot, you didn't need to memorize people's phone numbers, but other people, especially their husband, they're able to memorize. Anyway, and one of the things that I remembered about reading was that in graduate school, Bob and I were actually in this class, and we were supposed to read this novel. And I always hated it when classes would assign a novel to us, because I'm such a slow reader, arguably impossibly slow. And the teacher assigned A Prayer for Owen Meany, and I loved what I read, and I've since seen like a play production of the book, or at least one scene, that Christmas scene. Anyway, and I always just marveled and figured it must be because I'm lazy, that every one of my classmates would have finished the novel, a full-fledged 400-page novel or something, in a couple weeks or in a few weeks. And I would be like just trudging through that thing and be like 10% into the book. Because with other reading in graduate school, I could skim. Not that I wouldn't read it, but I could sort of skip around, and I wouldn't have to just sit there and read word for word the sentences, right? Textbooks lend themselves to that kind of perusal, if you will. And And plus, textbooks aren't as many words as a full-fledged novel, at least in theory. Or at least the kind of, often you would get assigned a textbook, but you'd only read half of the chapters anyway. So that came to mind the other day. I was like, oh yeah, remember when you would just secretly not finish the novel by the end of the term and try to act like you had? And I'm like, oh yeah. I was just figured I was just being lazy, and maybe I was partially, but there's another factor there. Nika, let's do one more. What would you do for a living if not being a psychologist? I think I actually answered this question on the live stream. I think I said plumber because that often comes to mind. And the little plumbing that I did, I actually liked it. It's very concrete, if you will, and it's fun to use the torch and the flux and the solder and all the thing. And plus today, although I wonder if plumbing today wouldn't be as fun because now they have that plastic stuff, which is great and so easy to use, But there's something about copper piping, so maybe a plumber, but that's probably not accurate, right? Because I'd probably be some kind of adjacent. I did actually seriously consider becoming a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon, neurophysiologist, a long time ago. I don't remember why, but I remember I got like some brochure in the mail and I was like, oh, and there was some program that was sending out advertisements and it just seemed like, oh, that seems so cool. I'm glad I didn't, by the way. I like this profession a lot better, I'm guessing. Maybe something in the medical field. I don't know. Well, I always wanted to be an astronomer, so working in astronomy, maybe an astronomer. If I had a clone, maybe the fourth clone would have an astronomy YouTube channel. I love that kind of stuff. A lot of what I watch on YouTube is astronomy. In fact, the very first podcasts I would listen to were astronomy and science. Before I listened to psychology podcasts, when podcasts first came out, at least in my awareness in like 2003, 2004, there was Fraser Cain, if you're familiar, and his podcast with Dr. I can't remember her name, but I listened to that podcast all the time. I was obsessed with that astronomy. I can't remember what it's called. Okay, one more question from Nika. Can you share some tips on how a fearful avoidant can heal and better function in relationships? Well, corrective experiences and awareness. So have awareness of the defenses that are not helping and that are distorting what you're seeing and convincing you of defensive strategies that are ultimately harmful to you and your relationships. And the second thing is to have corrective experiences in which you have secure, vulnerable attachments. So where you are being vulnerable, that's the key, which is very hard for fearful avoidance. And you are held, or at the very least not harmed, but maybe held, someone that cares. And I would be explicit about it. I've been explicit with my wife, told her, so in this moment, this is what I would like from you because it would be a corrective experience for me if this could go well. Being married to me is real fun. Anyway, that's the end of that episode. I didn't get to the rest. Maybe I'll have to make a third episode. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.